You think you know how this goes. The powerful man walks into a room, breaks a few rules, and the helpless girl swoons. This isn't that kind of story. This is about what happens when a man used to ruling the world with fear makes the mistake of insulting a woman in a language he thought he owned. He called her a nuisance, a stupid distraction. He did it in Arabic. She didn't cry. She looked him dead in the eye and called him a coward right back. The air inside the Gilded Ox always smelled like charred, rosemary-aged beef and desperate ambition. It was the kind of restaurant where men in tailored suits paid $400 for a steak just to prove they could. Freya Sullivan stood by the service station, staring blankly at a smudge on a polished wine glass. Her feet throbbed. It was a dull, rhythmic ache that started in her arches and shot straight up her calves. 7 hours into a double shift, the glamour of high-end dining had entirely worn off, leaving behind only the grease on the floor mats and the grating sound of jazz playing on a loop. I can't do it. Freya blinked, breaking her focus. Toby, one of the newer servers, was leaning against the espresso machine. He looked pale. Sweat beaded at his temples, catching the amber light of the dining room. Can't do what? Freya asked, reaching for her towel. Table 4. I can't take it. Toby swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically. It's him. It's Mercer. The manager just seated them. He looked at me, Freya. He just looked at me, and I forgot how to breathe. You have to take them. Freya sighed, tossing the towel onto the counter. Toby, it's a table of human beings. They want meat and alcohol. Write it down, bring it to them. It's not a hostage negotiation. You don't understand. Toby hissed, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. That's Gabriel Mercer. My brother works down at the docks. He says Mercer doesn't just run the unions, he buries people under them. Literally. I'll mess up the order. I'll spill water on him. Please. Freya looked across the dimly lit dining room. Table 4 was a large, circular booth tucked into the back corner, flanked by heavy velvet curtains. 4 men sat there. 3 of them were built like freight trains, shifting uncomfortably in their expensive jackets. The 4th man sat perfectly still. Gabriel Mercer didn't look like a mob boss. He didn't have the flashy jewelry or the slicked-back hair of a movie gangster. He looked like a private equity vulture. Sharp jaw, dark, neatly trimmed hair, a charcoal suit that fit him with the precision of a second skin. But it was his stillness that caught Freya's attention. The room was loud, full of clinking silverware and overlapping conversations. Yet, a quiet, heavy gravity seemed to pull everything toward his booth. Fine, Freya said, grabbing a fresh notepad. But you're closing my side station tonight. Done, Toby breathed out. Thank you. God, thank you. Freya smoothed her apron, pushed her shoulders back, and walked onto the floor. She had spent 4 years in a desert, listening to intercepted radio chatter from men who actually wanted to kill her. A guy in a nice suit, with a reputation, didn't crack her top 10 list of things to be afraid of. She approached the table. The 3 large men stopped talking instantly, their eyes locking onto her. Gabriel Mercer was looking at his phone, his thumb swiping slowly across the screen. Good evening, Freya said, her voice entirely level. Can I start you gentlemen off with something to drink? The man to Mercer's right, an older guy with a thick neck and a broken nose, scowled. We didn't ask for a waitress yet, and yet here I am, Freya replied, not missing a beat. We have a special on the reserve bourbon, or I can give you a few more minutes. The older man bristled his hand, twitching toward the inside of his jacket. But before he could speak, Gabriel Mercer raised a single finger from his phone. The movement was tiny, but the older man instantly shut his mouth. Mercer didn't look up at Freya. He just stared at his screen. The silence stretched. It was a power play designed to make her fidget, to make her uncomfortable. She didn't oblige. She just stood there. Her weight shifted onto her less sore leg, waiting. Finally, Mercer let out a short, irritated breath. He turned to the older man. He spoke rapidly, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "She is a stupid American girl. Tell the idiot to fetch the wine menu and disappear before she ruins my appetite." The words were spoken in Arabic, specifically a heavy, sharp Levantine dialect. Freya froze. The restaurant noise faded into a dull buzz. For a second, she wasn't standing in a Chicago steakhouse. She was back in a cramped, sweltering communications truck outside of Damascus, wearing heavy headphones, translating those exact harsh consonants into a microphone. Gabriel Mercer thought he was insulated. He thought he was surrounded by a wall of language that a tired waitress in a stained apron couldn't possibly breach. The older man smirked, opening his mouth to translate the dismissal into English. Freya beat him to it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't drop her notepad. She just looked dead into Gabriel Mercer's eyes and spoke. "The idiot understands you perfectly." The Arabic rolled off her tongue flawlessly, the accent crisp and utterly devoid of hesitation. The three massive men at the table froze. The older man's jaw actually dropped. Gabriel Mercer's head snapped up. For the first time all evening he truly looked at her. His eyes were a pale, striking grey, and right now they were narrowed in sheer shock. Freya held his gaze, feeling the familiar, cold adrenaline of a confrontation settling into her chest. She leaned in just a fraction, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "And if you had a spine, you would insult me in a language we both share. Coward." The word coward Jabban hung in the air between them like a live grenade. In that culture, in that dialect, it wasn't just an insult. It was a direct challenge to a man's honor. It was a word that got people killed. Arthur, the older man, half stood from his seat, his face flushing dark red. "You little—" Gabriel raised his hand again. "Flat. Palm down." Arthur stopped, instantly sinking back into the leather booth. Gabriel stared at Freya. The shock in his eyes morphed into something darker, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. He looked at her not like a waitress, but like a puzzle with missing pieces. He took in the cheap uniform, the tired bags under her eyes, the way she held her shoulders, rigid, defensive, trained. The silence dragged on for 10 agonizing seconds. Freya's heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of polite indifference. "We will have the reserve bourbon," Gabriel said softly, in perfect, unaccented English. "Neat. 4 glasses." "Right away," Freya said. She turned on her heel and walked away. She didn't run. She didn't look back. But as she reached the kitchen doors, her hands began to shake. By the time Freya returned with the tray of bourbon, the table was tense. The 3 associates refused to make eye contact with her. Gabriel, however, watched her every move. He watched how she placed the heavy crystal glasses on the table. He watched how she poured the amber liquid without spilling a drop, her hands completely steady now. He didn't say thank you. She didn't say you're welcome. They ordered their food in clipped English. They ate in silence. When it was time for the check, Gabriel dropped $500 bills onto the leather folio. "Keep the change," he said. It wasn't an act of generosity. It was a dismissal. Freya took the folio, nodded once, and walked away. 10 minutes later, as she was wiping down the now empty booth, the restaurant manager, Mr. Harrison, stormed out of the kitchen. His face was the color of a bruised plum. "Sullivan, my office, now." Freya tossed the rag into a bus tub and followed him. She already knew what was coming. "Are you out of your mind?" Harrison hissed the moment the office door clicked shut. He leaned over his desk, planting his knuckles on the wood. "Do you have any idea who that was?" "A customer who felt like insulting the staff in a foreign language," Freya said flatly. "That was Gabriel Mercer. He practically owns the district. His associate Arthur just grabbed me by the collar in the hallway and told me that if you are working here tomorrow, they'll ensure the health inspector shuts us down permanently." Freya crossed her arms, digging her fingernails into her own sleeves to keep her hands from trembling. "So what?" You're firing me because I stood up for myself. I'm firing you because you're a liability, Harrison snapped. You're done, Freya. Hand in your apron. I'll mail your final check. Freya stared at him. She wanted to yell. She wanted to flip the desk, but she was just so impossibly tired. The anger drained out of her, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. Keep it, she said quietly. She unpinned her name tag, dropped it on his keyboard, and walked out. The walk back to her apartment took 40 minutes. The Chicago wind was vicious, cutting through her thin denim jacket like a straight razor. She lived in a third-floor walk-up in a neighborhood where the streetlights only worked half the time. She unlocked her door, the deadbolt sticking the way it always did. The apartment was freezing. The radiator hissed weakly in the corner, offering nothing but noise. Freya dropped her keys on the counter and opened the fridge. Half a carton of milk, a wilting head of lettuce, and a jar of mustard. She closed the door and slid down the front of the fridge until she was sitting on the cracked linoleum floor. She pulled her knees to her chest. The reality of the situation began to settle in like lead in her stomach. Rent was due in 4 days. Her veteran's disability check delayed because of a bureaucratic screw-up at the VA was nowhere to be seen. The restaurant gig was supposed to bridge the gap. She squeezed her eyes shut. Why couldn't you just keep your mouth shut? Because she hated bullies. Because she had spent years taking orders from men who thought a title made them untouchable. Because the sound of that language, the language she had learned in blood and sand, being used to demean her, was too much to swallow. Across the city, in the back of a soundproofed black sedan, Gabriel Mercer was staring out the window at the passing streetlights. I still say we send someone to teach her a lesson, Arthur grumbled from the front passenger seat. You don't let disrespect like that slide, boss. The men saw it. Word gets out a Waitress called you a coward, it looks weak. Gabriel didn't blink. You think she was just a waitress, Arthur? Arthur turned around, his brow furrowed. What do you mean she's pouring drinks for tips? Of course she's a waitress. Nobody speaks that dialect of Arabic by accident. Gabriel said, his voice quiet, methodical. Not with that accent, not with that precision. It wasn't textbook. It was street-level Levantine, the kind you only learn if you live there. Maybe she's a refugee, Arthur suggested weakly. She's white, Arthur. Mid-20s. American as apple pie. Gabriel shifted in his seat. The ghost of her voice echoed in his head. Coward. No one had spoken to him like that in 10 years. Not without catching a bullet. But it wasn't the insult that bothered him. It was the absolute absence of fear in her eyes. When you rule by fear, the absence of it in someone else is a glaring red flag. The Lebanese syndicate is sending their new envoy next week. Gabriel continued his mind, working through the variables. We have millions tied up in the port logistics. The last translator we hired ended up feeding our route schedules to the feds. We're looking for a new one, Arthur said defensively. But it's hard to find someone who speaks the language, who isn't already in somebody's pocket. Get her name, Gabriel ordered. Call Harrison at the restaurant. Threaten him if you have to. Find out who she is, where she lives, and what she did before she was carrying plates. You think she's a spy? I think, Gabriel said, his eyes darkening, that I hate variables. And she is a massive variable. By 3 a.m., Gabriel was sitting in his home office, a tumbler of whiskey untouched on his desk. Arthur had come through. A thin manila folder lay open under the desk lamp. Freya Sullivan, age 26, former U.S. Army. Signals intelligence, rank sergeant, specialty cryptologic linguist, fluent in modern standard Arabic Levantine and Iraqi dialects. Discharged 2 years ago. Medical. Shrapnel injury to the left knee. No known criminal affiliations. Gabriel stared at the photograph attached to her military file. It was a standard-issue portrait. No makeup, hair pulled back, eyes staring straight ahead. She looked younger, but the hard, uncompromising line of her jaw was exactly the same as it had been in the restaurant. She wasn't a spy for a rival family. She wasn't a federal agent trying to infiltrate his crew. She was just a broke veteran trying to pay rent who happened to possess a very specific, very rare skill set. Gabriel leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, cold realization washing over him. He didn't need a hitman. He needed a translator, and he had just found one who couldn't be bought by the cartel because she clearly hated the criminal element. The knock on Freya's door came at 8:15 a.m. It wasn't a polite tap. It was 3 heavy measured thuds that rattled the cheap wood in its frame. Freya paused a spoonful of generic brand cereal halfway to her mouth. She was sitting at her tiny kitchen table, dressed in a faded t-shirt and sweatpants, her injured knee wrapped in an ace bandage. She set the spoon down silently. She didn't have visitors. The mailman just shoved things in the slot downstairs, and her landlord only came around on the 1st of the month. She stood up, ignoring the twinge in her leg, and walked softly to the door. She pressed her eye to the peephole. It was the older man from the restaurant. Arthur. He was wearing a long wool coat, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked bored, but his presence took up the entire cramped hallway. Freya backed away from the door. Her mind raced. Had they come to kill her? Over an insult, she knew the Mafia was petty, but this seemed extreme. She looked toward her bedroom. Under her mattress was a standard-issue 9mm pistol she had purchased legally after her discharge. It was unloaded, the magazine sitting in a separate drawer. She wouldn't have time. The knock came again, louder. Miss Sullivan. Arthur's voice drifted through the door, grating, impatient. I know you're in there. Your manager gave us your address. Open the door or I'm going to kick it in. I really don't want to kick it in. My knee acts up in the cold. Freya took a deep breath, steeling herself. Running was useless. Hiding was pathetic. She unbolted the door and pulled it open just enough to block the threshold. She didn't smile. You're trespassing, she said, her voice devoid of any tremor. Arthur looked her up and down, clearly unimpressed by her sleepwear. Mr. Mercer wants to see you. Tell Mr. Mercer I don't work for him. I don't work for anybody anymore, thanks to you. It's not an invitation, kid, Arthur said, stepping forward so the toe of his expensive leather shoe wedged into the doorframe. You can come in the car out front voluntarily, or I can throw you over my shoulder and put you in the trunk. Frankly, I'm tired and I'd prefer you walk. Freya looked at his shoe. Then she looked at his face. Give me 3 minutes to put on pants. Arthur nodded, stepping back. I'll wait. She didn't try to escape through the fire escape. She knew men like this. There would be someone in the alley. She threw on a pair of dark jeans, a thick sweater, and her heavy boots. She slipped a small pocket knife into her jacket, useless against guns. But it made her feel marginally better. Downstairs, a black SUV sat idling at the curb. The tinted windows hid the interior. Arthur opened the back door for her. She climbed in. Gabriel Mercer was not in the car. It was just a driver, thick-necked and silent. Arthur got in the front passenger seat. They drove for 20 minutes, winding through the city, until the glass and steel of downtown gave way to the industrial grey of the warehouse district. They pulled into a fenced compound with a large sign that read, Mercer Logistics and Shipping. It looked entirely legitimate. Forklifts were moving pallets. Men in high-visibility vests were shouting orders over the roar of diesel engines. It was the perfect front. Arthur escorted her out of the car and up a flight of metal stairs on the exterior of the main warehouse. They walked down a long, surprisingly modern hallway until they reached a frosted glass door. Arthur opened it, motioned for her to go inside, and shut it behind her without stepping in himself. The office was massive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the loading docks below. The furniture was minimalist, expensive, and cold. Gabriel Mercer was standing by the window, a cup of coffee in his hand. He was wearing a dark, button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faintly silvered with old scars. He didn't turn around immediately. He took a sip of his coffee. "I prefer my office to the restaurant," Gabriel said, his voice smooth. "The lighting is better, and fewer people eavesdropping." "Why am I here?" Freya demanded. She didn't move from the door. Gabriel turned. His grey eyes swept over her, calculating and sharp. He walked over to his desk and picked up a manila folder, tossing it onto the polished wood. It slid across the surface, stopping right in front of her. "Sergeant Freya Sullivan." Gabriel read, committing the details to memory, even though he already knew them. 4 years in military intelligence. Honorably discharged. You spent most of your time in a box in the desert, translating intercepts. Freya felt a cold spike of violation in her chest. "How did you get my service record?" "I own a logistics company, Miss Sullivan. Moving things across borders requires political friends. Political friends have access to databases." He leaned against the edge of his desk, crossing his arms. "You were highly commended. Top of your class at the Defense Language Institute." "I ask again, why am I here?" Gabriel tilted his head. "Because I have a problem, and you are the solution." Freya let out a short, harsh laugh. "You want me to translate for you? You insulted me, got me fired, dragged me out of my apartment, and now you want to offer me a job. I don't want to offer you a job. I am offering you a job." Gabriel's tone left no room for debate. "Next week, I am hosting a delegation from a Lebanese syndicate. We are negotiating a massive routing contract. The negotiations will be entirely in Arabic. Hire a translator," Freya snapped. "There are hundreds in the city. The last translator I hired was found in the Chicago River with his tongue cut out," Gabriel said casually, though the words made the air in the room drop 10 degrees. He was working for a rival family, feeding them our terms. "I cannot hire someone from within my world. They are all compromised." Freya stared at him. "And you think I'm not? You're a decorated veteran who lives in a rat-trap apartment and works double shifts at a restaurant you hate just to buy groceries," Gabriel stated brutally, tearing down her reality. "You don't have the money to be a spy. You don't have the connections. You are a complete outsider. I'm also the woman who called you a coward in front of your attack dogs." Gabriel's jaw tightened. A flicker of something dangerous crossed his eyes, but he suppressed it quickly. "Which tells me you aren't easily intimidated. That is exactly what I need, sitting next to me when I negotiate with men who slit throats for a living. I need someone who won't flinch. I won't do it." Freya stepped back, reaching for the door handle. "I don't work for criminals. I will pay you $50,000 for 3 days of work." Freya froze. Her hand hovered over the brass handle. 50,000. It was a life-altering amount of money. It would clear her debts, pay her rent for 2 years, fix her car, and get her the physical therapy her knee desperately needed. Gabriel saw the hesitation. He pushed off the desk, walking slowly toward her like a predator, closing the distance. "Your pride is commendable, Sergeant," Gabriel murmured, stopping just a few feet away. His proximity was suffocating. He smelled like expensive cologne and black coffee. "But pride doesn't pay the heating bill. You need this just as much as I do." Freya looked up at him. She hated him. She hated the suit, the confidence, the absolute certainty that he could buy anything or anyone he wanted. "I'm not one of your soldiers, Mercer," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "You don't own me." Gabriel looked down at her, his eyes tracing the defiant line of her jaw. "Not yet," he said softly. Freya didn't move. The $50,000 hung in the air between them, a heavy, invisible weight. It was a bribe. It was a lifeline. It was a trap. She looked away from Gabriel's face and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows. Down below, a forklift dropped a wooden pallet with a sharp, echoing crack. "Half now," she said. Her voice was dead flat. Gabriel didn't blink. "Excuse me." $25,000. Cash. In a duffel bag handed to me before I step foot in whatever room you're dragging me into. Freya turned her head, meeting his pale grey eyes. "The other half goes into an escrow account of my choosing the minute the negotiations conclude, and I want it in writing that I have zero liability for whatever illegal contraband you're moving." Arthur snorted loudly from the hallway, pushing the frosted glass door open an inch. "Boss, this girl is out of her mind. You don't make demands." "Shut the door, Arthur," Gabriel said. He didn't raise his voice, but the door clicked shut instantly. Gabriel walked slowly back to his desk. He opened a heavy oak drawer, pulled out a thick, leather-bound checkbook, and tossed it aside. Then he reached further in and pulled out 3 banded stacks of $100 bills. He dropped them on the polished wood. $30,000, Gabriel said. "Cash. Right now. You get the remaining 20 when the Lebanese delegation gets back on their plane. But there is a condition." Freya crossed her arms over her cheap sweater. "There always is. For the next 72 hours you do not leave my sight. You do not make phone calls. You do not go back to your apartment. You are a ghost to the rest of the world." A cold knot tightened in Freya's stomach. "I have a life. A cat. Arthur will feed your cat," Gabriel replied evenly. "The men we are dealing with are not street thugs. They are an international syndicate. If they find out who you are before the meeting, they will leverage you to get to me. They will break your fingers. They will hurt the people you care about. If you take this money, you are stepping into a war zone, Sergeant. Act like it." Freya looked at the stacks of cash. She thought of her overdue rent, the final notice from the physical therapy clinic, the bone-deep exhaustion of standing on her feet for 14 hours a day just to drown a little slower. She stepped forward, grabbed the 3 stacks of cash and shoved them into the deep pockets of her coat. "Fine," she said. "Where do we start?" Gabriel's lips twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest thing to approval she had seen from him. He hit a button on his desk phone. "Hayes," Gabriel said into the speaker. "Bring the car around. We need to get our new associate fitted." 3 hours later, Freya stood rigidly in front of a 3-way mirror in a high-end boutique off the Magnificent Mile. The shop had been cleared out. 2 massive bodyguards stood by the locked front doors. A frail, sharp-eyed tailor named Beatrice was pinning the hem of a dark charcoal suit around Freya's ankles. Gabriel sat on a velvet sofa across the room, drinking sparkling water. He watched her reflection in the mirror. "I told you to put her in the dress," Gabriel said, his voice carrying over the soft jazz playing in the boutique. "And I told you," Freya snapped, not looking at him, "that I am not wearing a cocktail dress to a business negotiation. I am your translator, not your escort. If things go sideways, I can't move in a tight skirt. If things go sideways, a pair of slacks won't save you from a bullet." "No," Freya agreed, turning slightly so Beatrice could adjust the jacket. "But it will let me kick the shooter in the throat before he pulls the trigger." Gabriel paused. He set his glass down on the glass table. For a second, the room was entirely silent. Then he let out a low, rough sound. A laugh. It was brief and dark, but it changed the entire architecture of his face, making him look devastatingly human. "The suit is fine, Beatrice," Gabriel said. "Expedite the alterations. We need it by tomorrow night." Freya looked at him through the mirror. He was already back to scrolling on his phone, the momentary warmth gone, replaced by the calculating ice of a man preparing for war. The meeting took place on the 42nd floor of a luxury hotel Gabriel completely owned. The penthouse suite had been stripped of its beds and replaced with a long, heavy mahogany table. The room smelled of ozone expensive espresso and gun oil. Freya sat to Gabriel's right. She wore the charcoal suit, a crisp white button-down, and flat leather boots. Hidden in the lining of her left boot was her folding knife. It was a psychological comfort, more than a tactical advantage. The room was packed with armed men. Gabriel sat perfectly still, his hands resting flat on the table. He radiated a calm, lethal energy. The heavy double doors opened. The Lebanese delegation walked in. There were 5 of them. 4 were muscle-thick, scarred men with dead eyes. The man in the center was older, wearing a bespoke tan suit. He had a neatly trimmed silver beard and smiled like a politician. Gabriel stood. "Simon, welcome to Chicago." Simon smiled wider, opening his arms in a gesture of fake warmth. "Gabriel, the city is as cold as your reputation." They sat. The pleasantries vanished instantly. Simon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He didn't look at Freya. He looked directly at Gabriel and began speaking in rapid, flowing Arabic. Freya's military training clicked in. The panic faded. The room disappeared. She was back in the wire room deciphering code. "He says, oh!" Freya spoke, her voice clear and authoritative, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. "The Port Authority in Beirut has raised their tariffs. They can no longer honor the 30% cut you agreed upon last year. They require 50% of the inbound shipments." Gabriel's face didn't change. "Tell him that is unacceptable. We front the logistical costs on this end. 30% is the ceiling." Freya translated, matching Gabriel's flat, uncompromising tone exactly. She didn't soften the Arabic. She used the precise, harsh consonants required to convey an absolute refusal. Simon's eyes finally flicked to Freya. He looked surprised. He had expected a stumbling, nervous academic. He got a soldier. Simon spoke again. "He says the risk has increased," Freya relayed. "The federal authorities have seized 2 of their ships this month. They are taking the brunt of the damage." The negotiation volleyed back and forth for an hour. It was grueling. Freya had to hold the exact meaning, the cultural nuance, and the underlying threats in her head, translating them perfectly while maintaining her own composure. Her throat was dry. Her bad knee throbbed from the tension in her posture. Then Simon leaned back in his chair. He picked up his espresso cup. He looked at the man to his left and muttered a single fast sentence under his breath. It was heavily slurred, drenched in a thick regional slang. It was designed to be ignored, a throwaway comment. But Freya caught it. Her heart gave a hard, violent thump against her ribs. She kept her face entirely blank. Gabriel looked at her, waiting for the translation. Freya reached for her legal pad. She didn't speak. She picked up her pen and wrote quickly in block letters. She slid the pad 2 inches to her left. Gabriel glanced down. "He just told his man, agree to his terms. We burn the warehouse tomorrow night, anyway." Gabriel didn't react. He didn't blink. He just casually flipped the legal pad over, hiding the words. He looked back at Simon. "Tell Simon," Gabriel said softly, his voice dropping to a terrifying register, "that we agree to 40%. But tell him I require the shipments to be moved out of the South Side warehouse tonight. If they are in my building tomorrow, the deal is dead." Freya translated. Simon's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. A microscopic twitch formed at the corner of his left eye. He looked at Gabriel. Then he looked at Freya. The politician's smile was gone, replaced by naked, venomous hatred. He realized immediately what had happened. The translator wasn't just parroting words. She was a wiretap. Simon set the cup down. He spoke in English for the first time. 40%. Simon said, his voice thick with a forced calm. "We move the product tonight. A pleasure doing business, Gabriel." "Always," Gabriel replied. The delegation stood. As Simon turned to leave, he stopped by Freya's chair. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. He smelled of peppermint and stale tobacco. He whispered in Arabic, "Watch your back, little bird. Chicago is a big city. Accidents happen." Freya didn't flinch. She met his dead eyes and whispered back in the same language. "I survived the desert. I'm not afraid of an old man in a cheap suit." Simon's jaw locked. He stared at her for a long second, then straightened up and walked out of the room, his men filing out behind him. The heavy doors clicked shut. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. Freya let out a long, shuddering breath. Her hands hidden under the mahogany table were shaking violently. Gabriel slowly turned his head to look at her. "What did he say to you?" Gabriel asked. "He told me to watch my back," Freya lied smoothly. She didn't want him knowing she had provoked a Mafia boss. Gabriel reached out and flipped the legal pad back over. He stared at her handwritten note. "You just saved me $8 million in inventory," Gabriel said, "and the lives of 12 of my men who work the night shift at that warehouse." Freya swallowed hard. "Then I earned my 30,000. "You earned a target on your back," Gabriel corrected, his voice grave. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Simon doesn't leave loose ends. He knows you tipped me off. You embarrassed him in a room full of his soldiers. I did my job," Freya said, pushing her chair back and standing up. A sharp bolt of pain shot up from her knee, causing her to stagger slightly. She caught the edge of the table. Gabriel was there in a second. He didn't touch her, but his hands hovered inches from her arms, ready to catch her. "Your leg," he observed. "It's fine. It's just stiff." Freya gritted her teeth and stood straight. "I want to go home. The job is done." "The job is done, but the threat isn't," Gabriel said. He pulled out his phone. "Arthur, bring the armored car to the basement. Tell Hayes to secure the perimeter. We aren't going to the office." "Where are we going?" Freya demanded. Gabriel looked down at her. The coldness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a fierce, heavy possessiveness. "You're coming home with me." Gabriel's estate was a fortress, disguised as a mansion. Located 20 miles outside the city, limits it sat on 50 acres of dense black woodland. High iron fences surrounded the perimeter, and Freya spotted at least 3 security cameras hidden in the stone pillars by the front gate. The inside of the house was massive, echoing, and entirely devoid of warmth. There were no photographs, no books, just slate floors, dark wood, and minimalist furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, not a home. Freya stood in the center of the kitchen, feeling entirely out of place. She had stripped off the charcoal suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of her white shirt. She was exhausted. A deep, bone-weary fatigue had settled into her muscles, the adrenaline crash hitting her like a physical blow. Gabriel walked into the kitchen. He had removed his tie and unbuttoned the collar of his shirt. He walked to the massive stainless steel refrigerator, opened the freezer, and pulled out a gel ice pack. He walked over to the marble island and tossed it in front of her. "For the knee," he said. Freya looked at the ice pack. She didn't want his help. She didn't want to be here. But the throbbing in her joint was blinding. She muttered a quiet thanks, pulled a stool out, and sat down. She hiked up the leg of her trousers and pressed the ice against her scarred knee. Gabriel opened a cabinet, pulled out a heavy crystal decanter, and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He slid one across the island to her. "Drink," he ordered softly. "It helps the adrenaline crash." Freya eyed the glass. "Is it poisoned?" Gabriel took a slow sip of his own drink. "If I wanted you dead, Freya, I wouldn't have brought you to my house. I would have let Simon have you." She flinched slightly at the brutal truth of it. She took the glass. The liquor burned a fiery welcome path down her throat. "You handled yourself well today," Gabriel said, leaning against the counter. He watched her intently. "Most seasoned men would have stuttered. You didn't even blink when he threatened you. I've been threatened by worse men," Freya said, staring at her glass. "I doubt that. Simon skins people alive for stealing from him. And I spent 2 years listening to men plan the bombings of civilian hospitals." Freya shot back, her voice suddenly sharp. She looked up at him. "Your world is violent, Mercer. But it's small. It's about money and territory. The men I dealt with did it for God. You don't know what real terror sounds like until you hear a man praying while he arms a detonator." Silence fell over the kitchen. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator. Gabriel stared at her. The hardened, cynical mask he wore seemed to slip just a fraction. He looked at the scars on her knee. He looked at the shadows under her eyes. "Where did you get the shrapnel?" he asked quietly. Freya stiffened. "It's not in my file. Your file says medical discharge. It doesn't say how." She took another sip of the liquor. The alcohol was loosening the tight defensive coil in her chest. "Outside Aleppo," she said, her voice dropping to a hollow murmur. "Our convoy hit an IED. The blast flipped my transport truck. I woke up pinned under the steering column. My commanding officer was bleeding out in the passenger seat. I spent 4 hours trying to keep him awake while translating distress calls over a broken radio. He died 10 minutes before the medevac arrived." Gabriel didn't offer fake sympathy. He didn't apologize. He just took another drink, his eyes locked onto hers. "And then you came home," Gabriel said, his voice stripped of its usual commanding edge. "To a country that doesn't care, to a government that loses your checks, and to a restaurant where men in suits treat you like garbage." "Something like that," Freya whispered. Gabriel set his glass down. He walked slowly around the kitchen island. Freya tensed instinctively, but she didn't move away. He stopped right in front of her stool. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. He reached out slowly. Freya's breath caught in her throat. Gabriel's fingers brushed the fabric of her rolled-up sleeve, tracing a small, faded scar on her forearm. His touch was shockingly gentle. It was at complete odds with the violence of his life, with the blood she knew was on his hands. "I called you a coward," Gabriel said, his voice barely a breath. "In the restaurant, in my head. I thought you were just another weak, breakable thing in a city full of them." He looked up, his grey eyes locking onto hers. The intensity in them made her chest ache. "I was wrong," he said. "You are the strongest thing I have ever seen." Freya's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew what this was. It was a line being crossed. It was the dangerous magnetic pull of two people who understood the dark, violent edges of the world. She pulled her arm back, breaking the contact. She couldn't let this happen. "Don't do that," Freya said, her voice shaking slightly. "Do what? Pretend we are the same," she said fiercely. "I am a soldier, Gabriel. I protect people. You are a predator. You exploit them. I am here because I need the money to survive. The second that threat is gone, I walk out that door, and I never look back." Gabriel's expression hardened, the vulnerability vanishing behind a wall of ice. He stepped back. "Of course," he said smoothly, though a muscle in his jaw ticked. "Strictly business." He turned and walked toward the doorway. He stopped under the arch, looking back at her one last time. "Lock your door tonight, Freya," Gabriel said. "My men patrol the grounds, but Simon is resourceful. Don't trust anyone." He walked out, leaving Freya alone in the massive, echoing kitchen. The ice pack was melting against her leg, and the whiskey burned in her stomach, but she had never felt colder. Sleep was a ghost that refused to visit. Freya lay on top of the covers in the sprawling guest bedroom. She hadn't changed out of her clothes. Her boots sat on the rug right next to the bed, perfectly aligned, ready to be stepped into. The digital clock on the nightstand bled a faint blue light into the dark room. It was 3:14 a.m. The estate was entirely silent. The heavy insulation of the mansion swallowed the wind outside. But silence in Freya's experience was never empty. It was just holding its breath. She stared at the plaster ceiling, running through the layout of the house in her mind. Main stairs to the left. Service elevator at the end of the hall. Windows facing the east lawn. It was a habit born in the desert, a compulsive need to know her exits. A sharp metallic spit broke the quiet. It was muffled, distant. But Freya had spent 4 years listening to gunfire. She knew the dull, truncated cough of a suppressed weapon. She rolled off the mattress before her conscious brain even processed the danger. Her bare feet hit the hardwood floor without making a sound. She grabbed her folding knife from the nightstand, flicking the blade open with a soft click. It was a pathetic weapon against heavily armed men, but her hands needed the familiar weight. Another suppressed shot, closer this time. Then came the heavy dead thud of a body hitting the floor out in the hallway. Simon hadn't waited. He hadn't bothered to regroup in Lebanon. He had bought off someone in Gabriel's perimeter detail and sent a hit squad straight into the fortress. Freya pressed her back against the wall next to the heavy oak door. She didn't breathe. A shadow passed under the crack at the bottom of the door. A hand tried the handle. Locked. The shadow paused. Freya gripped the knife tighter, angling her body. If he kicked it, she would go for the femoral artery the second the wood splintered. Instead, a muffled voice murmured something in Arabic. "Leave the girl. Find Mercer. Upstairs." The shadow moved away. Heavy, tactical footsteps retreated toward the main staircase. Freya closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She could stay in the room. She could crawl under the massive bed, wait for the gunfire to end, and surrender to whoever was left standing. Gabriel Mercer was a criminal. He was a ruthless man who ruined lives for profit. Let him fight his own war. "I am not one of your soldiers," she had told him. She opened her eyes. The cold logic of survival told her to stay put. The burning, stubborn core of her chest told her something else. Gabriel had put a target on her back to save his men. He had poured her a drink when her hands were shaking. Freya unlocked the door, twisting the deadbolt with agonizing slowness. She pulled it open an inch. The hallway was empty. A guard lay face down on the carpet 50 feet away, a dark pool expanding around his head. She slipped out into the corridor. She moved like a ghost, hugging the wall, her breathing shallow and controlled. Gunfire erupted from the floor above. It wasn't suppressed this time. It was the deafening, chaotic roar of an automatic rifle echoing through the cavernous house, followed immediately by the sharp, rhythmic crack-crack of a handgun returning fire. Gabriel was awake. Freya took the service stairs. She bypassed the main staircase where Simon's men would undoubtedly be funneling. She took the concrete steps 2 at a time, ignoring the sharp spikes of agony in her knee. Adrenaline drowned the pain. She eased the door to the 3rd floor open, just a crack. The corridor was thick with the acrid smell of cordite and drywall dust. 2 men in dark tactical gear were moving slowly down the hall, their rifles raised, trained on a set of double doors at the far end. Gabriel's bedroom. They were communicating in sharp, clipped Arabic. "He's pinned. Flank the left." They didn't look behind them. They assumed the lower floors were clear. Freya didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the morality of it. She slipped out of the stairwell, closing the distance in 3 silent strides. She grabbed the trailing man by his tactical vest, yanking him backward off balance. Before he could shout, she drove the folding knife upward, burying it deep into the soft hollow under his jaw. Blood sprayed hot and wet across her hands. She clamped her left hand over his mouth, riding his falling weight to the floor to prevent a thud. The point man turned at the slight scuffle. He saw Freya kneeling over his partner. He raised his rifle. Before he could pull the trigger, the double doors at the end of the hall splintered outward. Gabriel stepped into the frame. He wore a dark T-shirt and slacks. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated violence. He didn't flinch at the sight of the rifle. He simply raised his handgun and fired twice. Center mass. The point man dropped like a stone. The hallway plunged into a ringing, heavy silence. Gabriel kept his gun raised, sweeping the corridor. His eyes found Freya. She was kneeling on the floor, breathing heavily, her hands coated in bright red blood. She slowly stood up, wiping the blade of her knife on the dead man's vest. Gabriel lowered his weapon. He stared at her, his chest heaving slightly. "I told you to lock your door," he said. His voice was entirely devoid of breathlessness, but it carried a ragged, raw edge. "I did," Freya replied, picking up the dead man's rifle and checking the magazine. "But they were going to kill you, and I still need the other $20,000 for my escrow account. Gabriel looked at her. He looked at the rifle in her hands, the blood on her shirt, the complete absence of panic in her posture. A grim, dark smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Arthur is dead," Gabriel said flatly. "They caught him at the gate. My backup team is 10 minutes out. Until then, it's just us." "How many more?" Freya asked, racking the bolt of the rifle. 6, Gabriel said, stepping over the threshold. "They're coming up the east stairwell. Take the left wall," Freya ordered, falling into step beside him. Gabriel didn't argue. He didn't try to protect her. He just nodded, trusting the soldier beside him. The backup team arrived 12 minutes later. By the time Hayes and a dozen armed men breached the front doors, the house was silent. They found Gabriel and Freya sitting on the floor of the second-story study. The room was destroyed. Bullet holes shredded the leather furniture. Glass from the antique lamps blanketed the Persian rug. 4 of Simon's men lay dead in the corridor outside. Gabriel was leaning against a mahogany bookshelf. His left arm was wrapped in a bloody towel. Freya was kneeling beside him, using a strip of her torn shirt to tie a makeshift tourniquet above the deep graze on his bicep. Hayes stopped in the doorway, taking in the carnage. "Boss, we have the perimeter. It's over. Clean this up." Gabriel rasped, his head falling back against the wood. "No police. Call the cleaner. I want these bodies incinerated." Hayes nodded once and vanished. Freya pulled the knot tight on the bandage. Gabriel winced a sharp hiss, escaping his teeth. "Sorry," she muttered, though her tone didn't carry much apology. She sat back on her heels, wiping a streak of soot from her forehead with the back of her wrist. The adrenaline was finally fading. The reality of what she had just done settled into her bones like lead. She had killed a man. Again. After promising herself, she left that life behind in the desert. Gabriel watched her. The pale grey of his eyes was entirely focused on her face, reading the subtle shifts in her expression. "You're shaking," he observed softly. "I'm fine," Freya lied, staring at her blood-stained hands. "You aren't fine. You killed a man for me." "I killed a man to survive," she corrected sharply, looking up at him. "Don't flatter yourself." Gabriel didn't smile. He reached out with his good arm. His large, warm hand closed over her trembling fingers. He didn't pull her close. He just held her hands, grounding her. The blood on her skin transferred to his, mixing together until it was impossible to tell whose was whose. "I shouldn't have brought you here," Gabriel said. The words sounded like they were torn out of him. It was an admission of guilt from a man who never apologized. "I thought my world was contained. I thought I could use you, pay you, and send you back to your life. I was arrogant." Freya looked down at their joined hands. The warmth of his grip was entirely at odds with the freezing cold of the room. "Simon won't stop," Freya said quietly. "He lost men today. He lost face. He will come after you again." "I know," Gabriel said. "Tomorrow Hayes will drive you to O'Hare. I have a jet waiting. It will take you anywhere in Europe you want to go. I will wire $500,000 into your account. You change your name. You disappear." Freya froze. She pulled her hands out of his grip. "No," she said. Gabriel frowned, his brow furrowing. "This isn't a negotiation, Freya. You are a civilian. You are out of your depth. If you stay in Chicago, Simon will find you, and he will flay you alive just to send me a message. Stop treating me like a helpless wait person." Freya snapped her voice, rising over the sound of Hayes's men dragging bodies down the hall. "I am not a civilian, Gabriel. I spent 4 years surviving ambushes. I survived tonight. You didn't save me. We saved each other." Gabriel pushed himself off the bookshelf, ignoring the fresh wave of blood soaking his bandage. He leaned over her, his size and presence overwhelming the space between them. "Do you think I want you to go?" He snarled, the polished veneer completely breaking. Do you think I want to put you on a plane? I have lived in the dark for 15 years, Freya. You are the first person who has looked at me without fear. You called me a coward to my face. You fought back to back with me. He reached out his hand, wrapping around the back of her neck. His thumb brushed along her jawline. His touch was desperate, possessing a raw, aching intensity. I want to keep you, Gabriel whispered, his face inches from hers. I want to lock you in this house and kill anyone who looks at you. But if you stay with me, this will be your life. Blood on the floor, sleeping with a gun under your pillow. You hate this world. You hate men like me. Freya stared into his eyes. She felt the heavy, rhythmic thud of his pulse against her skin. He was right. She hated the corruption. She hated the violence. But she also hated the crushing, soulless grind of her civilian life. She hated the feeling of being invisible, of being entirely powerless while the world stepped on her. With Gabriel, she wasn't invisible. She was a weapon. She was an equal. I hated the men who gave the orders, Freya whispered back, her hands coming up to grip the front of his ruined shirt. But I never hated the war. Gabriel's breath hitched. He closed the distance, his mouth crashing down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was violent, hungry, and born entirely of survival. It tasted of ash and copper. Freya kissed him back with the same brutal urgency, her hands fisting in his shirt, anchoring herself to the only real thing in the room. They had both survived the night. They were alive, and the only way to prove it was the desperate friction of their bodies. Gabriel pushed her back against the bookshelf, his good arm wrapping around her waist, lifting her slightly off the ground. Freya wrapped her legs around his thigh, ignoring the screaming pain in her knee. She didn't care. She wanted the heat. She wanted to erase the cold hollow in her chest. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. If you stay, Gabriel warned, his voice a low gravel. There is no walking away. You don't get to quit when it gets ugly. I never quit, Freya said, but we play by my rules now. Gabriel let out a dark, breathless laugh. Whatever you want. 2 weeks later, the sky over Chicago was a brilliant, freezing blue. The Mercer Logistics warehouse was running at full capacity. The sound of forklifts and diesel engines echoed through the massive steel structure. Up in the glass-walled office, the atmosphere was entirely different. Gabriel sat behind his desk. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, the only sign of his recent injury, a slight stiffness in his left shoulder. Sitting across from him was the new envoy from the Lebanese syndicate. Simon was not there. Simon had been found dead in a hotel room in Detroit 3 days prior. Official police reports cited a massive heart attack. The underworld knew better. Gabriel had sent a message, and the syndicate had understood it perfectly. They had sent a new, much more agreeable representative. Freya sat to Gabriel's right. She wasn't wearing a borrowed suit this time. She wore her own, a sharp, slate-grey cut that fit her flawlessly. Her posture was relaxed, confident. She didn't look like a translator. She looked like a partner. The envoy spoke rapidly in Arabic, offering a very generous concession on the shipping routes. Freya listened. She didn't scramble for a notepad. She just met the envoy's eyes, holding his gaze until he looked away, intimidated by the coldness in her stare. He's offering 20% of the gross to cover the inconvenience of last week, Freya said in English, not looking at Gabriel. And he guarantees no further disruptions. Gabriel leaned back in his chair. He looked at Freya. What do you think? The envoy blinked, surprised. Mob bosses didn't ask their translators for strategic advice. Freya crossed her legs. I think 20% is an insult to the men who died cleaning up Simon's mess. Tell him we take 30, and we control the port manifests in Beirut. We dictate what comes in. Gabriel smiled. It was a slow, predatory expression. He looked at the envoy. You heard the lady. The envoy swallowed hard, nodding quickly. He stammered his agreement in Arabic, signed the contract on the desk, and practically ran out of the office. When the door clicked shut, the heavy silence returned, but this time it was comfortable. Gabriel stood up and walked over to a small side table. He poured 2 glasses of scotch, walking back and handing one to Freya. You're going to bankrupt them, Gabriel said, leaning against the edge of his desk. They can afford it, Freya replied, taking a sip. The liquor was smooth, burning warmly in her chest. Besides, you owe me. My escrow account is still waiting on the final deposit. Gabriel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy velvet box. He tossed it onto her lap. Freya set her glass down. She opened the box. It wasn't a ring. It was a solid gold key. What is this? She asked. The key to a safety deposit box at the downtown branch, Gabriel said. It has $2 million in untraceable bearer bonds inside. It's yours. No strings attached. If you ever decide you're tired of this life, if you ever decide you hate me, you take that key and you disappear. I won't follow you. Freya looked at the key. It was an out. It was a safety net. It was the ultimate gesture of trust from a man who trusted no one. He was giving her the power to leave him. She snapped the box shut. She didn't put it in her pocket. She tossed it back onto his desk. It landed with a heavy thud next to the signed contract. Keep it, Freya said, standing up. She walked over to him, stopping inches away. I told you. I don't run. Gabriel looked at the box, then back at her. The icy reserve in his eyes melted, replaced by a fierce, possessive warmth. He reached out his hand, wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against him. Good, he murmured against her mouth. Because I was lying. I would have hunted you to the ends of the earth. Freya smiled against his lips. It was a cynical, dangerous smile. I know, she whispered. She grabbed the lapels of his expensive suit and pulled him down. Outside, the city of Chicago kept turning brutal and cold. But inside the glass walls, Freya had finally found a war she was willing to fight. And she intended to win it. If this story hooked you, you know exactly what to do next. Smash that like button, drop a comment below, letting us know your favorite moment between Freya and Gabriel, and share this video with anyone who loves a gritty high-stakes romance that doesn't pull its punches. Your support helps us create more intense original stories with characters who actually fight back. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. What should Freya and Gabriel face next? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching.